Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Philosophical Liberal. This is our Substack for 1776 Forward, our new series that we recently launched, diving deep into our statement on the meaning of philosophical liberalism. I'm joined by my co-founder of 1776 Forward, Joya. Great to see you, Joya.
Great to see you as always. I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, I am too. Well, and let's dive right in. So today's question is, what is liberalism? Building off of the first two sessions we had, the first one where we outlined our vision for philosophical liberalism, the ideal that we're championing at 1776 Forward, and then we decided to break down the meaning of the two parts of that term. We covered what is philosophy last week, and so this week we had to do it justice and are covering what is liberalism. So Joya, I know you had some really interesting thoughts you wanted to start off with on the topic of liberalism, or maybe even preceding that, freedom. So you want to start?
Yeah, let's start with freedom and let's let everybody know that this is essentially going to be somewhat of a two-part episode. Today we're really, I think, going to be focused on the concept of liberalism, but liberalism is, as you've pointed out, dependent on the concept of freedom. And so next time we're going to do an even deeper dive exploration of freedom because I think there is so much to cover here, but I don't think we can actually get to what is liberalism without first talking about what is freedom. And what I think is going to emerge from our conversation is that the whole meaning of what liberalism is has always been difficult and murky. And as far as I'm concerned, that's because it is dependent on the concept of freedom. And the concept of freedom itself can be hard to define. And so part of what I think we're going to try to do, and part of the value add we want to bring to this conversation ultimately is to try to give some definitions to ultimately liberalism and then also freedom. But let's start by even pointing out why, at least in my opinion, freedom is so difficult. Because from my perspective, when we're talking about freedom, freedom ultimately is a subjective feeling. It's the feeling that you are no longer constrained, no longer oppressed. Instead, where you had been perhaps feeling constrained, oppressed, imposed upon, now you are released and you are free. But the difficulty is, as I've always put it, one person's subjective experience of freedom can literally be another person's experience of tyranny. And there are actual historical examples of people living through legitimate tyrannical governments and regimes who report a feeling, sensation of freedom within that. But to draw this out, I even thought it might be useful to give an example from culture. So, a salient example that comes to mind, I think most people know that the Japanese culture, as opposed to Western culture, is in many ways much more formal in terms of its social rules and expectations. And it's a common experience. So, people know I even have a background in travel. When Westerners travel to Japan, they will often experience that the formality of the customs of Japan, they would have an experience that it imposes on their sense of freedom. But interestingly, when you talk to people in Japan, there are plenty of people who would say the opposite, that instead that those rules, those expectations, those formalities give them a sense of freedom. That quite the opposite, that the informality of the Western culture to them is more imposing, constraining. The very fact that so people who would, vouch for the freedom aspect of the rules of Japan would say that, that there is a script to follow, that they don't have to worry about the right thing to say or how to approach someone, that they know what it is because it's all already been laid out. Whereas then when they are suddenly transplanted to the West, there's this risk that you could get it wrong and you have to kind of take the responsibility to figure out what to do. And I think that's going to get into a lot of our conversation here. We're going to talk about how freedom is dependent upon responsibility. You hear that a lot, that with freedom comes responsibility. And I think the key point of that often is missed and is important to recognize is that with responsibility always comes risk. And for many people, what they want is the freedom from risk. And
Mm,
all of this is to lead up to say that now, when we were talking about liberalism and a political structure that guarantees freedom, we're talking about a very specific kind of freedom. And so it might not even be freedom that feels free to certain people, but that
mm.
having some common definitions is going to help us in determining exactly what it is that we mean, what we're talking about, what we're advocating for, and then why we're even going to make the case for it. But at this point, I think I'll turn it over for you for any reflections on what I've just said, and then also maybe to get us started on thinking about now moving toward from just the subjective feeling of freedom to what is liberalism in political sense.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's fascinating. You did preview that for me, before as we were discussing in preparation for tonight's discussion. But it still strikes me kind of hearing it in full. Um, I just wonder, I guess, so you would say freedom is fundamentally a subjective or even like a psychological or emotional state. Like if we're just defining terms, like it almost is broader than even what we typically think of it as meaning or pertaining to political freedom. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I would say this is as someone with a background in English language and literature, it's in a sense maybe one of the misfortunes of the language that freedom can be so broad. But I think there
Mm,
is a real validity to this fact that when we need a word for the experience, the feeling of, as I said, of not being imposed upon, not being oppressed upon, not being constrained upon. There is a longing that all people have for that sense of release from a sense of constraint. But then
mm,
it's
mhm,
fascinating that what one person would find constraining, another person would find to be liberating.
interesting.
But I think
Right.
that even leads to a lot of the difficulties and the confusions in the history of freedom and liberalism, precisely for this reason.
Well, and so then maybe you can kind of provide the bridge, and then I can make I'll kind of add some of my thoughts as we transition to liberalism as a concept. But then how do you apply this understanding of freedom as a more psychological phenomenon, let's call it, psychological emotional one, to then the meaning of political freedom or kind of freedom in a political context?
Right. Well, I think we're going to see as we do this exploration of what liberalism is that the movement toward liberalism came from people seeking freedom from the imposition of, well, perhaps monarchical or government control. And so that was the specific freedom that was trying to be advocated for and understood and argued for, but that I I think even as we've seen sort of what's happened with the history of freedom and liberalism, that perhaps how things get off track always comes back to this fact that one person's freedom could be another person's tyranny. That,
Mm,
that some people would have actually experienced more freedom under the monarchical systems that the people advocating for freedom were trying to get away from.
interesting. Well, I know that definitely implicates on some of the subsequent topics to come that we're going to dive into about things like you said, responsibility and the risk that comes with it, um, being productive and taking charge of your life in a productive manner, things like that. But we'll table that for now. And then I'll just I guess pick up the ball that you just left me on then what is liberalism to back to the question of tonight's discussion. Um, with that grounding, I would say liberalism at its most fundamental level is about political freedom. It's the ideology, which is just another way of saying political philosophy or program that one seeks to enact through politics of freedom, and specifically of then the historical movement and science behind how to construct a government or a proper society that advances freedom. And we actually do define in our preamble of our statement, which I'll read here, but we do define what we see as the four pillars of liberalism and what freedom in this political context means. So I'll just read from that. Well, we start with philosophical liberalism, where we talked about a moral political idea,
Yeah.
and we say it shares with other forms of liberalism a focus on individual rights, and I would say the mirror image of that is individual liberty, the consent of the governed, political equality, and free enterprise. And, all four of those are, I think, widely accepted as the four pillars of liberalism, the political philosophy. And a lot of that comes from, like you said, I guess the root of this push for political philosophy of liberalism is from people wanting to feel unconstrained by overbearing authority, by social structures and what have you, and kind of emerge from this long chain of thought and development, that through these four pillars, that was the path to human happiness, success, and progress. So, I guess uh, I'll stop there, see if you want to add anything to that kind of definition of liberalism and just any other thoughts.
I think that's a great start, and maybe we'll point out that I think each of these, I think, four pillars is worth talking about more. And that's why we're going to have a subsequent discussion, I think, and even really try to break down exactly what each of these mean, and maybe even tease out what we specifically understand these concepts to mean, and perhaps how they've been interpreted differently in the past. But again, I think some of these different interpretations all go back to the fact that ultimately, freedom itself can be so variable, and that's perhaps why it's so important to start to come together on what exactly we do mean. And I think it's important to point out, I think it's going to come out in our conversation, that as you've already alluded to, that when we're talking about liberalism, there's a way in which we understand liberalism in the Western tradition to have begun in the Enlightenment with these thinkers who were feeling constrained by their monarchical European governments. But that even there's the long history of liberalism that really points out to the way in which this is a universal human experience of advocating for the sovereignty of the individual. And I think, as we're going to point out, of the individual as a social being, and
Mm.
how this individual can flourish. But this is just more just setting up what we're going to get into.
Yeah, well, and thank you. That's a great segue because I think if we're going to talk about what is liberalism, and for those of you who've read our statement, you'll see that we are advocating for philosophical liberalism, which we distinctly kind of identify and differentiate from, just capital L liberalism standalone. But I think it's important to know where that comes from and some of that history. And certainly, since both Joy and I, our backgrounds are in ideas from different angles and students of the history of philosophy and history as such, I think it's a fascinating and important topic here. And yeah, I think you raise a great point. So traditionally, and if you go to Wikipedia or ask ChatGPT, both of which we've reviewed and compared in our own preparation efforts for this discussion, they'll usually ground it in the era of the Enlightenment, which was the period of really the 18th century, the kind of late 1600s through the early 1800s. And John Locke, a British philosopher, who in I think it was 1690 wrote his treatise on government, and that was really the first time that all of these strands of thought kind of came to building up over hundreds and even thousands of years of history came together in kind of a directed, targeted program of how do we construct a good society with the aim of human freedom as the primary objective. Um, but yeah, like even in my own study of the history of ideas and history more broadly, as well as my prep for this discussion, it really struck me that Locke was really just inheriting a long line of work that goes back to certainly at least ancient Greece and Rome. And even while the history of liberalism is undoubtedly a Western movement, certainly capital L liberalism and the ideology and political philosophy of freedom. Um, it is a universal human impulse that, I mean, even influences as diverse as Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching from Chinese culture and Taoism, and so many other cultures have elements of either, as you said, this human innate desire to be free from constraint, or even just the recognition of the sovereignty of the individual. And so, obviously, ancient Greece and Rome were great pivotal moments in human history in that they tried to actually first nascent steps to start to build a society ordered in this kind of image. And then we had the kind of medieval or Middle Ages period, the so-called Dark Ages. But interestingly, even, people always cite the Magna Carta as a founding document for liberalism or human freedom, and that dates back to the 1200s. So, you see, I guess my takeaway in the history of liberalism is that while John Locke was a pivotal feature in the Enlightenment, this has been a universal struggle of many sorts.
Yeah. And well, I'll try. I had an interesting experience trying to have this conversation with Claude AI, and the same thing. When I first started, just asking it, to like give it some initial prompts. It wants to send me back to exactly who you're saying, like Locke and the era of the Enlightenment. But you know, asking it to dig deeper, tell me more about, go further back into the roots of, what was Locke going on and the other thinkers of the Enlightenment era. And Claude was able to pull out for me, as you're pointing out, like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China, ancient India, and even the Muslim Middle East all had these strands of what ultimately became liberalism. And the most fascinating thing that Claude eventually told me was that it saw the American founding
Mm,
as essentially a great synthesis of bringing together all of these strands of global thought from you know, eras spanning back, millennia, and really bringing it into this sort of grand synthesis, and not only synthesizing the ideas, but obviously taking it into action and building new institutions out of it. And I love that. And I feel it's even just perfectly appropriate to what we're trying to do with an organization that we named 1776 Forward, because I think in our own way, we're trying to even further that synthesis with that same bias toward action and kind of taking the ideas and figuring out how to build upon them here on Earth.
absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head. This even explains much of the what's in the name behind our organization, is that, insofar as Locke was really the pivotal moment intellectually of bringing these disparate strands into a kind of coherent political philosophy. The founding of America in 1776, almost 100 years later, we see as the pivotal fulcrum point just in human history in actually implementing those ideas, constructing a new society, a new institution, if you will, in the image of liberalism. And, kind of everything since then, I feel like the rest of the history of liberalism in the world, and certainly in Western history in America, kind of follows from that pivotal moment. And we'll talk a little bit more in today's discussion in the follow-on about how that has then evolved, or in some cases devolved. Anything else you want to add just on the history?
Maybe we'll just say that like I'll share. Maybe you can share like what we eventually even got from the AI readings, because it was fascinating just to see even how that they these tools that we have now available to us were able to summarize these questions for us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we're essentially encapsulating an even shorter version of some of these summaries, but we'll definitely share. I did some prompting myself with ChatGPT, that model, and I ultimately got it or created a framework for it to kind of boil down the history into essentially 12 bullets comprising kind of six key figures and six key events or moments in liberal history. So I think that we touched on all the key parts here, but I think that'll be fun to share as well. Um, and then, kind of going back maybe a little bit or trying to this is as Joya said going to be somewhat of an iterative conversation because you can't really talk about liberalism without understanding freedom and vice versa. So there was kind of 2 points that I think we talked about even prior to coming on that we wanted to make just about the concept of freedom, and in particular how you kind of need freedom in all areas of life, that they're particularly in the American context today, contemporarily, and even going back for a while in our own history, there's been kind of a core divide between kind of supposedly economic freedoms or lack thereof, and then personal or civil liberties. And so just, kind of, I guess that point that certainly what we advocate with philosophical liberalism is that that's kind of a false dichotomy and that you need really both. So I don't know if you want to say anything on that or I can elaborate too.
Yeah, I mean, if you have an elaboration that you want to make, go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just ultimately comes down to what we advocated 1776 forward and in our statement of philosophical liberalism about the link between thought and action, that as human beings, we are beings of mind and body, of thought and action. And um, the way I think of it, at least, is that economic and so-called personal or civil liberties are kind of just different manifestations of those two dualities or polarities of human identity, the thought, the action, and the thought, respectively. And so to me, when we talk about why as human beings, because of our nature as thinking beings who have to act on our thoughts for our survival, that we need freedom to do both, to me, it's just a logical extension that you need the freedom to both not only think and feel how you are and be who you want to be, but to take action on that. And economic freedom, which is really just dealing with the domain of productive work, which is literally the act of helping create the products for your survival. Like it's just uh, it's incontestable from my perspective that that is the foremost human action that requires freedom, precisely because it's the way in which we support ourselves and advance our material flourishing. So I guess that to me is like how I see that connection and how you kind of overcome that divide, is that they're really just two equal parts of what it means to be human, our thought and our action.
I couldn't agree more that if anything, the problem is trying to take this whole and see it as a duality instead of seeing it as an integration that ought to work harmoniously. And so that when we're arguing for freedom, or arguing for what you might call this holistic version of freedom that enables you to flourish as a whole human being. But that will even get into our subsequent conversation and the next of our three core values.
Mm-hmm. And then I think the second point we wanted to just touch on that goes back to kind of what is freedom and how to think of it. And this, I think, I now have a better appreciation for this point based on how you opened up the discussion. But, kind of differentiating political freedom from other forms of freedom, and maybe even, I know this is the thought you've mentioned and talked about in the past, but what are those other forms of freedom? What is their relevance to political freedom, or how do the two interact, if at all?
Well, this one I think is interesting. I think especially because our audience here, I think, are people who are entrepreneurs and people who even have that entrepreneurial spirit. And there was a real way in which most entrepreneurs recognize that the key value that perhaps we're all after as entrepreneurs is freedom. And one of those freedoms is the freedom to define what freedom means for us. So I know in
Mhm.
conversations that I've had with other entrepreneurs, we talk about the different kinds of freedoms we want. And and here we're often even thinking about freedom from what might be the conventional corporate sense of
Mm.
work. But you can see even as I enumerate these, how it expands outward beyond just that. But we talk about wanting to have like financial freedom. We talk about wanting to have time freedom. We talk about wanting to have location independence or location freedom. There's the sense of wanting to have psychological freedom, the way of like being your own boss. And a lot of even what drives entrepreneurs is even from a deeper sense of a kind of spiritual freedom. So here's like just all of the freedoms that I think as entrepreneurs, especially we are known to want and crave. But to tie this back to your point, that without a system of political freedom that would allow us to really fully enact this, that you can't really have any of these freedoms without sort of the core freedom that comes from political freedom.
Yeah, that's well said. The way I kind of was thinking about this point is, and I think this maybe proves your point, that freedom is kind of a broader concept than political freedom, which we're talking about here in the context of what is liberalism, is that there are other forms of freedom in human life. And the way I think about it is that political freedom is almost kind of the foundational freedom because in many ways, all of those other freedoms which you ticked off, you could almost see them as analogous to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that concept which we've talked about. And insofar as many of these things, like even the concept of entrepreneurialism, is not even something that existed for humanity until the Industrial Revolution and capitalist political liberty, societies founded in the image of political liberty. So um, many of these other dimensions of human life, which are very important, and we're going to get into why they're critical to taking humanity forward into the 21st century and beyond, they really are not even possible without political freedom because it's political freedom that has created the conditions through which we've even been able to develop technology and progress, and certainly to the degree that we have now, where we can even start to think about what does it mean to self-actualize and to achieve happiness and this kind of spiritual fulfillment or these other higher order needs, which are real human needs, but that when we lived in a pre-industrial and pre-liberal society where most human beings' entire existence depended on subsistence, kind of labor, that wasn't even possible.
And if I would add anything to that, I think you have to say that it's both political and economic freedom. And I would
Well,
say it's
right, yes.
unfortunate that we have to say it is both political and economic
Well,
freedom, because
now,
as far as
yes.
I'm concerned, political freedom should mean both political and economic freedom. As we
Right.
pointed out in the four pillars of what liberalism entails, one of the key pillars is free enterprise, free markets. But
Yes.
unfortunately, as we're going to see, in the history of how liberalism has developed in the West, from the American example in Europe, and unfortunately, there has become somewhat of a divide, a seeming divide between political and economic freedom. And I think hopefully what we're hoping to do here is to repair that into the sort of the more holistic version of freedom that understands all the freedoms, including political freedom, and political freedom importantly includes economic freedom as well, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, well said. Or said another way, political freedom should encompass economic freedom so that such that they're redundant, but unfortunately in today's day and age, they're not. And that actually does, I think, segue us into, I think for most of our listeners and followers who are American based, they are probably they probably read our statement, they're probably listening to this conversation and they're saying, something doesn't add up. The way liberal is understood and used in common culture today is not necessarily what we've been talking about here. So why is that? What gives? And I think that since we're giving a mini history lesson in today's discussion here, it's a relevant point because in the American context, liberalism did evolve in a different way and direction than it did throughout most of the rest of the world. And the critical distinction I think is rooted in this false alternative or divide between so-called economic liberties and everything else, personal civil liberties, social needs. And that is a very distinctly American phenomenon, I guess, to point out. And so the history is that within, just as another brief history lesson, in the US context around the late 19th century, really with Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. Um, and interestingly, although Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, he was kind of more like a third party. He was really part of they self-described progressive movement in the history of American politics. I see Joya rolling her eyes, and I share it because we're going to get into why even progressivism as a term in the American lexicon is used improperly. But this is how the history books characterize that movement. And in a real way, we talk about this. The progressives of the late 19th, early 20th century, they were not just wanting to go back to the past or preserve a past order. They did value making change, and in their minds, positive change for society, but they were certainly not necessarily um, focused on securing these kind of four pillars that liberalism had been defined with. So it was with Teddy Roosevelt and his famous or infamous, depending on your view, trust busting of really instituting the American federal government for the first major time into regulating and interrupting commerce and economic activities, that then from that, and then he used the term liberal to describe his movement, and the rest of the subsequent progressives on through Woodrow Wilson in through the World War I period did the same, even though their project was very much to go beyond the limits of the Constitution. They said that explicitly. They thought it was too limiting to what a liberal government should do, and then it was really solidified further with FDR. And so this term got associated specifically with the political left or the Democrat Party in the American context. Um, but again, I think the essential point here is that this whole movement started to draw this kind of false divide between economic liberties and kind of everything else, and then B, they took on a greater focus or emphasis on kind of society at large, social welfare, kind of government support, safety nets, all of that, which was, that was just not a program for liberals elsewhere around the world. And even to this day, the term liberal and liberalism everywhere else in the world is still meant to define parties that largely are aimed at those four pillars, which in kind of modern jargon or understanding is kind of defined as like a more limited government that's less focused on kind of the welfare state and kind of the group rights or goods, and more still the sanctity of the individual.
Anything else you wanted to add to that, or?
No, I mean, I guess we talked a little bit before, just right before we jumped on here, about, I guess, my one observation I have from that era is that, as we kind of just alluded to, the Industrial Revolution, it happened after America was founded and after kind of Britain went through its Enlightenment and reform periods. So, and after Adam Smith, another key point, which when he wrote The Wealth of Nations was actually also 1776. So just doubly made the importance of that year, because that was the founding tome for capitalism. And all of these things came out of that era, but really by Roosevelt's time, you only had 100 years of that progress and development. So, in the span of human history, and certainly living humans' experience of the time, it was massively disruptive. Change happened at a greater scale than it ever had in thousands of years prior. And the disparities that capitalism and its progress generated, I think, took a lot of people by surprise and created sufferings and, senses of injustice. And so my interpretation of even the reaction of Roosevelt and others like him to wanting to kind of bust the trusts and interfere with economic affairs was rooted in kind of a misunderstanding. I like how you put it, kind of a misunderstanding of the integration between all all the spheres of human life, the thought and the action, and how that's expressed in economic activities versus personal activities. And they're trying to grapple with all the change that the Industrial Revolution unleashed, but not knowing how to do it in a way that preserved the values of liberalism, or certainly the aims of a free society.
And I think that's a really important point a parallel for our own era and to get to the timeliness of the project that we're doing. And I think why we think it's so important to have these discussions and start this movement now, because clearly we are on the cusp of another revolution that promises to be even grander than what the Industrial Revolution was in terms of the rapidity of change. I think how much it's going to take people by surprise, and how I- in these times of disruption and upheaval, clarity about key concepts is perhaps more important than ever. We could see how when that clarity was missing, it led to like not only second order consequences, but third, fourth, fifth, and I don't know how many orders you could possibly go down from Roosevelt to now. So, but I think it just lends itself to why it's so important for us to really get clarity on key important concepts now, and like, what this movement should be as we approach something similar in our own era.
Yeah, well said. And I think you're right to tie it to the era we're entering. I mean, AI is certainly the buzzword on everyone. We cite it even now, and we're leaning into trying to adopt and apply this technology for our own work here, and seeing both its benefits and limitations. But AI as an expression of just kind of the digital onrush of tools and techniques that are quite literally probably going to change who we are as human beings and how we conceive of ourselves in that way, just in the same way that the Industrial Revolution took us from being farmers and people who worked the land to people with machines and worked with our hands and eventually then our minds. Yeah, I think we're on the cusp of potentially even more disruptive change. And I think you're right. I think there, and we're going to get into this as a separate topic, progress versus stability or order, as we call it, and the integration of those two. But like so many things in human life, those two are often set up as competing alternatives, and an either or type of choice for most humans. And therefore most people, when presented with that choice, particularly in times of disruptive change, tend to kind of fear the progress part and pull back from it. And if we want to take the spirit of 1776 and liberalism forward and advance more freedom, maximum freedom for maximum number of human beings for flourishing and greatness, then we need to prepare ourselves and lay the cultural political foundation for people to have clarity around these concepts and know how to apply them even amidst the disruption.
Great. Anything else that we want to cover in this discussion, or are we ready to start wrapping up and setting up for part two?
Um, let's see. Not from my perspective. I guess was there anything you wanted to add on kind of just the history or evolution, devolution, depending on your perspective of the meaning of the term liberalism, and even just the project of liberalism's aims in the American context versus kind of everything else we've talked about, how it's traditionally been kind of understood or applied elsewhere in the world.
I think just to point out that just ties back to, there is a real way in that clearly what we are doing with philosophical liberalism is a form of liberalism, and we're going to get into this in our next conversation, because I think we're really going to break down, you've been calling them like the four pillars, these four key ideas that have always been part of what's sometimes even called classical liberalism, which as you pointed out, one of the reasons why we call it classical liberalism now is because it's not the liberalism of the present. And there is a real way in which, in a sense, we are building from that classical liberalism tradition, but we are not in any way a reactionary movement. We are focused on the forward progress and even building from those roots, those four pillars of classical liberalism, and have creating our own synthesis, taking in the wealth of knowledge that's developed, the wealth of evidence that we've garnered since Adam Smith wrote *The Wealth of Nations* about how free markets actually operate, about how rights are ought to be applied in society, and build from that. And clearly, I think we've talked about the ways that liberalism has devolved. I think it's important to point out that there have been forward advances too, just in terms
Mhm.
of civil rights and rights for women and rights for gays that I think would all fall under what we would understand to be individual rights that have been marked improvements as well. So it's even taking from that and building upon it and going forward. But I think we're even at a point that sets us up to maybe have a stopping point and pick up again in part two.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I definitely have more to say on that, and we didn't even touch upon kind of conservatism, kind of the right side, but we'll get into that in the follow-up discussion. Kind of, I guess, part two of what is liberalism, and even more kind of what is, liberalism, and the project of political freedom.
Okay. So, did you
Great.
want to introduce our call to action
Yeah,
for?
so for this week's call to action, we want to hear. So one of the pins that I hope to have some time to come back to at some point. When I think about, and I think this problem is rooted even in some of the confusion of terms, and misuse of terms, liberal and liberalism in the American context again. But I was reflecting on just how, you know, the term liberal or liberalism in America is essentially a pejorative. It has negative connotations today, and that's for many reasons. If you're a partisan Republican or conservative from the right hand half of the political equation, it has obvious pejorative means because of the opposition there. But even between people on the left and then between people on the right who support the four pillars, but still think there are limitations to it. There's criticisms of liberalism from every direction. I mean, I guess you could say it's a factor of its success and its dominance still, but nonetheless, both the left and the right criticize liberalism. I would argue, and my observation is that a lot of times what people are calling liberalism is something is not what the historical project we are talking about and building off of entails, but nonetheless that is the cultural zeitgeist and milieu that we inhabit. And so it just struck us to say, well, are there critiques of liberalism that you have encountered in your own life that you either find compelling and or that you don't know how to answer in response to? Um, and we would just love to hear people's thoughts on what are some of those critiques and maybe some of the issues or questions you're wrestling with in how to answer them. I think particularly just as some examples, from kind of the right wing side today, there's a lot of criticism of so-called neoliberalism, which is often really oriented around like globalism and liberals that promote kind of participation in supranational organizations like the UN and the WHO, things like that. So that's one attack. And then from kind of more the left-wing perspective or even the religious perspective, they both come at critiques of liberalism as somehow alienating and or a hyper-focused individualism that is somehow negative or doesn't advance human flourishing and a good society. So, and those are potent arguments. So those are just two examples that I see are rising in the cultural conversation. So if you have your own, that would be our call to action, is share with us some of the critiques you find most compelling or confusing.
Yeah, and I'll say like we'll address that when we do the pins, and then but it'll be a much more interesting discussion to get some of your feedback too, and then hopefully what we're doing is even starting to build an arsenal to help all of us approach these conversations within the current culture in a stronger, more fortified way.
Excellent. I think that covers it. So, with that, we will see everybody in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening as always. And you can find us on Substack. Please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that little button at the bottom. It's actually one of the beauties of Substack. They embed it all over the page. So you have multiple options, and please share it too. That's how we grow this movement, is by growing the people who are participating and joining us for these conversations.
Wonderful. See you next time, Chris.
See you. Bye.